to the self-serving, I must say, in that case, it's money. But when the president has an enemies list, and when the president instructs Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, to go and find something on that person in order to make their life miserable, this is absolutely horrific, because it's not just about targeting that person, which is bad enough. It's about suppressing dissent or enforcing loyalty, suppressing dissent by anyone else and saying to everybody else, you better do exactly what I say. I can issue a pardon if you do what I say and it's illegal, but I can issue a subpoena and prosecute you if you violate, well, if you fail to do exactly what I want.
Will the senator from Oregon yield for a question?
I would love to yield to another question.
So when you look at how this all started, I think about all of these people who have stood up, as you are standing up today. I think about career prosecutors in the Justice Department who have basically said, no, I am not going to do the bidding of the president, whether I was appointed during a Republican presidency or a Democratic presidency, whether I personally vote Republican or vote Democrat. I have a job to do, and that is follow the laws of the United States. And I think the real first indication of this, where people realized just how off the cliff this was going, was when, in fact, there was pressure put on career prosecutors in New York to dismiss these charges that had been the result of a long investigation involving Mayor Eric Adams. And what I remember from that time was Danielle Sassoon, who was a very, very well-respected conservative prosecutor, someone that came up through the Federalist Society, who had clerked for conservative justices, that she decided to resign rather than do their bidding because she felt that it wasn't consistent with the law, that was against the law. And then another career prosecutor named Hagan Scotton, who was a decorated veteran who had clerked for then Judge Kavanaugh and Justice Roberts. He said, when asked to file a motion in that case, you may find a fool or a coward to file that motion, but it won't be me. And those words always echo in my mind. I say to the senator from Oregon as he stands up today, of these people through these last months, whether it is standing to march with their kids on their hips, whether it is to stand up, as so many of us have done in this chamber, to fight for health care, whether it is people who, like the statistician at the Labor Department, simply doing her job, willing to stand up and give the facts of what the job numbers were, and then the president didn't like it and had her fired, which I always thought was ironic when it's about jobs numbers and then you lose another job. But in any case, he just fired her, or going after governors at the Federal Reserve, or deciding which states he's going to take funding from. In my home state of Minnesota, as I know you've experienced in Oregon, he cut a bunch of energy projects. And I looked at the list, I thought, wait a minute, these are all grid projects. So many of them were major, major projects with private companies to provide energy in neighboring states like North Dakota and South Dakota. I kind of looked at the list and saw all the funding because the company was based in Minnesota, but all the funding for our surrounding red states. And I just thought, oops, I guess they didn't mean to put this on the list. All of that combines, as you look at what's happening with the Justice Department right now, as a president that is basically decided that there are no norms. And so the only norms left is this body, because the House has decided they're not coming back right now. They're waiting for these Epstein files that they hope will just go away, but it appears they will never go away. They won't even seat a duly elected member of Congress from Arizona because they're so afraid of these Epstein files. So while that's going on and they're basically decided to just stay home and hang out and not come to work every day, this is the functioning chamber, as close as it can come, that is supposed to be dealing with the matters before the country. And the matter before the country right now is what is happening with our healthcare system. On November 1st, these premiums are going to be doubling in so many states. You look at some of the states that actually Donald Trump won, like Florida with millions and millions of people on these plans. You look at Texas, 75% of the people on these plans live in states, that Donald Trump won. So while all that is going on, the president goes to his go-to, and his go-to is messing around with the justice system. He literally pardoned someone, as in George Santos, who claimed to be a world-class volleyball player, producer of the Spider-Man movie, and was actually simply a fraudster that the entire Republican leadership in the House of Representatives booted out of the House of Representatives. The president says, I'm going to bring this guy back too. Because every single day, it's that strong arm techniques. Doesn't care if it leads to more violence, doesn't care if it violates the oath of these lawyers in the Justice Department, doesn't care if people get fired, doesn't care about, what does matter? What does appear to matter is making news that day. What does appear to matter is getting on, dominating the news that day. Not our country, not the rule of law, but the one thing I can say, and I ask this of my friend, the senator from Oregon, because the president seems to think this, but does in fact trump the Constitution? Isn't it a fact that our laws and our Constitution, which has withstood wars, withstood the Great Depression, withstood Watergate, withstood all these things? Why? Because people stood up, as the senator from Oregon is doing today. Judges stood up, as we're seeing across the country. There are Trump-appointed judges that have made decisions time and time again contrary to this administration because it's against the rule of law. We saw that in the tariff case, those tariffs that are burdening the small businesses in our state. We saw a Trump-appointed judge, a Reagan-appointed judge, an Obama-appointed judge join together and say the tariffs are illegal. So this is happening. Judges are standing up. Our constituents are standing up, as we saw over this last weekend, millions and millions of people standing up in what was the most biggest peaceful protest in the history of this country. And yes, Congress needs to stand up. And that's what the senator from Oregon is doing today. Standing up and saying, this is not normal. This is not normal to have a Justice Department that is doing what they're doing. So I do ask the senator from Oregon, despite him not being a lawyer, to talk about the fact that Donald Trump cannot trump the Constitution of the United States.
I thank so much the question my colleague from Minnesota has laid out. In fact, at least 8 or so topics that I'm going to enjoy addressing. But your final point, does Trump the Constitution? Do we have kings, if you will, in the United States of America? And the answer is, under the Constitution, obviously not. And I so appreciated the name of Saturday's demonstration. 7 million people demonstrating at some 2,700 sites across America saying no kings. And many versions of the most creative possible statistics laid out, of pictures laid out in that process. But you are absolutely, your question, there are no kings under our Constitution. But the president, in all of these things that I've laid out through the course of the night, the attack on the rule of law, the continuous effort to suppress free speech and free press, the attack on due process, the attack on the law firms, the attack on the universities, the use of violence, and the weaponizing the DOJ, all of it is the way a king acts. So in fact, we are in the middle of an authoritarian takeover. It's not down the street, it's not around the corner, it is here right now. And speaking of being here right now, I see my minority leader is on the floor from New York, and I would welcome a question if he has one.
Well, first, thank you, and I do have a question for you. I want to commend you for your fortitude and your strength on a subject that is so important to the future of this country, not only for our generation, but for our grandchildren. We need a democracy, and my question is this. In many authoritarian regimes, there are many characteristics, and we see a lot of this happening in Hungary, in fact. Orban has had his friends take over the media. Orban has used the prosecutorial authorities as a weapon, as Trump has turned our whole Justice Department into an attack dog to go after his enemies and help his friends. And we see this in so many other countries. Now, there are many people in the United States say it can't happen here, and our roots of democracy are stronger and deeper, certainly, than in Hungary's. But the danger is real. And could my friend, and I so respect what he has done all night, could my friend just elaborate on the question, it is different here, but why can we not be complacent when we've seen what happens in other countries like Hungary, like Turkey, and of course, even more severe dictatorships? When people say it won't happen here, why should we, even though we're different, why should Americans from every political corner, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, be fighting this authoritarian rise in this country led by Donald Trump, who, as you said, wants to be king?
I so appreciate the question from the minority leader from New York. And one of the things that I certainly felt was, this can't happen here. Our institutions are too old. We have 200 years of practice. We have features that have helped reinforce our constitutional framework. We have a solid middle class. We have a good education system. We have deep traditions in the House and Senate. We have norms that reinforce our constitutional understandings. And yet, it turns out that my confidence that authoritarianism could not take hold in America is wrong. And one of the things I have done over the course of the night is to read multiple chapters and commentary to professors who looked at countries all over the world, including Hungary, and said, here's how it happened. They said, we used to think about the end of a democracy as being something done by men with guns. They burned down the presidential palace, they shot the president, maybe they killed his family, they tore up the Constitution, and they said, here's the New Deal. But now, that rarely happens in comparison to the new version in which democracies are put into the grave. And that new version is by elected individuals who start to erode the separation of powers. And if you think about it that way, you just really need three things to become an authoritarian state. You need a Congress that says our role is to just back up and do what the president says, a rubber stamp Congress. And in large part, we have that right now. I can't tell you how many times colleagues have said, I can't take that position because it would upset the president, even though I'm not happy about the situation. Well, so there's that. And then you need a court that confirms or conveys more power to the president. And we have seen court decision after court decision that have conveyed more power, like Trump versus United States, saying the president is above the law. And you combine the president being above the law, as long as it's shielded by an act of government, and pardon power, and now the whole executive branch feels, well, we're all above the law. And then the president comes into office and just starts ignoring one law after another. I think a real early one that got a lot of attention was the firing of inspector generals. And of course, the law says you have to fire them for cause. And the law says you have to give 30 days notice. But the president didn't either. And in the end, he didn't really get the courts saying you can't do that. And then Trump says, you know what, I'm just going to start establishing tariffs around the world. Well, tariffs are not a power delegated to the president. The very first bill the U.S. Senate ever worked on was a tariff bill. They spent 3 weeks assigning a tariff to different things, a keg of nails or a barrel of molasses and so on and so forth. And so this collective factor brings us to the third element that creates the authoritarian state, which is a president who wants to defy the law, create a space in which saying the laws do not apply. So suddenly the checks and balances are gone, and it's not the authoritarianism that we need to fear a year from now. It's here at this very moment. And so this is why we should all, if we had any doubts a year ago, we should all now be going, oh my God, we are not immune from the same strategy that's been pursued with the same authoritarian playbook in country after country after country.
Thank my colleague for that really right on the money exposition of this, and I'd just like to ask one more question related to the first, the supine Congress. Our Republican colleagues seem to just do whatever Trump wants, and we hear lots of mumbling and grumbling, we don't like it. But I hear from some of them saying to me, it wouldn't make a difference if I spoke up. Does my colleague from Oregon agree with that it wouldn't make a difference, that if Republicans, whether it's the leadership in the House or Senate, or a large number or even a decent number of members spoke up against the kind of authoritarian direction that Trump is taking, does my colleague think it wouldn't make a difference, as they say, or does he think it would?
Well, I believe it would make an astounding difference. Because when I come to the floor, or any of my Democratic colleagues come to the floor and say, look at this attack on due process, this is just wrong. Look at this effort to tell universities what to teach, this is just wrong. Look at the attack on law firms, and they've been essentially blackmailed into $1 billion of free legal help to groups that Trump wants, that's wrong. Look at the effort to ship people out of this country because of what they say on foreign policy. That's just the violations of free speech and due process. And we say it's just wrong. But in essence, we are speaking within a communication bubble that exists around our urban communities. And there is a different communication bubble that exists around our rural communities. We have driven this into this situation through cable news, where people in my state who live in cities watch one version of the world on cable. They see a different version if they're in rural areas watching a different cable, and then it's reinforced by social media. So when a colleague across the aisle speaks up, now a whole new audience is hearing about what's going on in our country. And it has the act of integrity because it's not coming from across the aisle. It can't be dismissed as a partisan comment. It is clearly a comment of principle. So when you have both a comment that is absolutely principle and a comment that reaches into a different media sphere, now you start to have an enormous impact, and others will have courage to follow. Because I have heard from my colleagues about some of these pieces that they are worried about but are not speaking up on, one person steps forward, maybe takes the hits from some of the right-wing commentators, and maybe actually gains some respect from others who say, you know, that is for sure the truth.
Thank my colleague, I do. And I thank my colleague from Minnesota for her excellent back and forth with the Senator from Oregon. Thank you for doing this. I yield the floor.
Thank you very much to my colleague from New York for those two questions. And one of the questions that my colleague from Minnesota asked about was mentioning the $230 million in compensation that Trump is trying to get out of the government. And so I found the story about that and wanted to fill folks in on what that is. President Trump is demanding that the Justice Department pay him about $230 million. That's a lot of money. To folks in my neighborhood, $1 million seems like an unfathomable sum, and here we're talking about $230 million, $250 million in compensation for the federal investigation into him, according to people familiar with the matter. This is an article by Devlin Barrett and Tyler Pager on October 21st, 2025, so hot off the press, if you will. The people familiar with the matter who added that any settlement might ultimately be approved by senior department officials who defended him or those in his orbit. So you have the president suing his own government, and he has the Justice Department, in which there are people who were on his defense team now working, who would be the ones to ultimately approve a settlement. This situation, this article goes on to say, situation has no parallel in American history, as Mr. Trump, a presidential candidate, was pursued by federal law enforcement and eventually won the election, taking over the very government that must now review his claims. It is also the starkest example yet of potential ethical conflicts created by installing the president's former lawyers atop the Justice Department. Lawyers get to play both sides. They were on his team that brought the lawsuit.